All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. We're going to get right into it. This is part 2 of our special series we are doing, officially calling it Family Jewels, about the Church Committee hearings in 1975, 1976, which investigated and exposed a lot of shady activity by the NSA, FBI, and CIA. Last episode, we talked about Meddling Abroad. This episode, we are going to talk about Meddling at Home, which was largely known as COINTELPRO. Here to first tell me what that stands for and then talk about the activities are our guests, as always, for this, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
And back is Rick Perlstein, historian, journalist, author, Before the Storm, Nixonland, The Invisible Bridge, Reaganland, and more importantly, Ride Along for the Family Jewels. Rick, thank you for joining us for part 2.
Ride or die, guys.
Ride or die. Well, if the NSA gets its hands on you, you never know. Okay. COINTELPRO. Kelly, what's it stand for? And we've touched on it a few times, on this show, but paint the picture of what came out in these 75 revelations.
So COINTELPRO is the counterintelligence program, and basically it runs from 1956 to 1971. And so in this 15-year period, Hoover, who's basically running the FBI at the time, is infiltrating a lot of American civil rights organizations, leftist organizations, feminist organizations, anything that he thinks might be a threat. And much of these people who are being investigated, some of them know it, some of them don't. Some of them find out later that there are huge files on them. And the way that they are being investigated is through really a by any means necessary approach. So, and I use that very much intentionally, knowing that they're targeting someone like Malcolm X, they're targeting Martin Luther King Jr. and Angela Davis and the Black Panther Party, and people like Jane Fonda. The list goes on and on and on. So with COINTELPRO, Hoover tells FBI agents that their goal is to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of these movements and especially their leaders, and block anyone that he might consider that has a messiah personality.
Takes one to know one.
Right. Yeah.
There you go.
The domestic angle here actually helps us understand both why this was so shocking to Americans who thought that they were not under surveillance by the federal government, but also the origins of the family jewels themselves, because this comes out of this document, the 700-page collection of bad deeds by the intelligence community, comes out in response to revelations around Watergate, that the FBI was being implicated in Watergate for helping out with that. And so you have the head of the FBI come in and say, wait a second, we need to get an accounting of what exactly it is we're doing that is outside the bounds of the CIA, of the FBI. And so they pull together, everyone just kind of reports in. They're like, oh, this is the thing that I was doing that's probably not kosher. And it becomes this huge 700-page file of bad acts by the intelligence community.
I mean, it was like, that's not a very great political move to have to admit to the people who are charged with, investigating you that they might have files on you too, right?
Yeah. Well, they were hoping that would never actually come out. So we should get into some of the specific details of who was being gone after. But I do have a kind of bigger question about COINTELPRO, which is, was there a theory of the case in terms of who they were going after? Was there a larger cohesive battle, or was it really just kind of like, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We can do this. Someone rubs us the wrong way. Boom, open a file on them.
Yeah, you might not agree with it, but there might be an argument that someone who, say is an ally of the Communist Party has this kind of political connection to a foreign policy that is a stated enemy of the United States, right? You can kind of justify that. But it was much more kind of anyone who was dissident to even kind of the cultural norms,
Like
just
John
like one
Lennon.
of the people who,
Yeah,
John
Yoko
Lennon,
Ono.
right? John Lennon was being kicked out of the United States because he was working on registering young voters, right? Wonderful book about that by John Wiener of UC Irvine. Jean Seberg, right? This wonderful actress who was dating a Black Panther, did commit suicide. They succeeded in what they didn't succeed with, MLK, right? Jane Fonda, telling Henry Fonda, her father, that their daughter was hanging around with, communists. And J. Edgar Hoover had this, security file, security index, I think it was called, of 10,000 people who would be rounded up in the case of an, national emergency. And, one of the people was, Mario Savio, head of the free speech movement in Berkeley. And there's this wonderful book on the FBI that I really, really love called Subversives by Seth Rosenfeld, who spent 30 years trying to get Reagan's FBI files, right? And he was an informer. And they would follow, Mario Savio, his every change of address. So they could round him up, when the bad guys came, even though he had nothing to do with, the Soviet Union. It was just kind of this ideological thing. And the tragedy of that was, some of the changes of addresses were a mental hospital, no address. So there was no legitimate kind of threat from any of these people.
It's interesting because there is a theory of the case, Jody, in the sense that, we've talked about this in the John Birch Society episode, that there were outside agitators who were the ones who were actually responsible for everything from civil rights protests to anti-war protests to feminist groups, that this was all part of a coordinated effort being orchestrated from abroad.
To weaken the country.
Right.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, when you actually look at what's happening, there are times when it's just purely political, when presidents are reaching out to the FBI and the CIA to say, hey, could you look into X as a way of getting information on their political opposition. So there's a theory and then there's how it actually works in practice.
And one of the tactics that the FBI would do is that they would find some vulnerable kid who petty theft, some sort of minor offense. And they would say to him, hey, or her, hey, we want you to infiltrate the Black Panther Party. And if you don't do this, you're going to get 5 years in prison. And so they would have them infiltrate and get information and get intel.
Right.
And then, and also, those would be the people that would be in a Black Panther Party and say, you know what we should do? We should blow up a building. We should throw a bomb.
Agents provocateurs. And often very vulnerable. They would seek out psychologically vulnerable people. And, we all know what happens when prosecutions are built on things like that. Then they would have a conspiracy trial, as they did, for example, the Harrisburg 7, the supposed plot to assassinate Henry Kissinger. And it was all based on this kind of crazy guy's infiltration. And this rural Pennsylvania jury acquits them. Yeah. Right? Because they're because a lot of the comedy of it is that these FBI agents aren't very smart. John Wiener's book on John Lennon is just full of hilarious attempts of these guys to trying to figure out the Beatles, and why there's a whole thing about John Lennon cutting his hair and what does that mean? And they're not very hip, . I
always thought it was funny that Black Panthers would say they could tell, the FBI, if they were, 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 if they were who was a cop or who was an undercover cop, because cops, when they walked, they had all this, gear on them, their nightstick, their gun, all that stuff. So that even when they weren't wearing it, they still sort of walked with a limp in their gait. And so they'd be like, oh, he's a cop, he's a cop, he's a cop.
Or they'd be like, they would have 10 hours a day to volunteer suddenly, because they're on the payroll.
I mean, that idea of hipness actually does matter, because there are all of these complaints from FBI agents who are infiltrating these groups, complaining about the fact that they have to grow out their hair long. And it drives home what a square institution it was, and also how stark the lines were around appearance and gender performance and
culture,
all of those things that make it actually very difficult to fit in if you're not genuine.
But it was, devastating as whoever knew it would be into kind of the relationships of trust that a movement needs, especially one that's, slightly underground. So you have these, situations where Ron Karenga, and the Black Panthers are beefing on each other because they're being spurred to it by COINTELPRO, and the paranoia is so intense that you can't possibly be an effective political organization.
Oh, yeah.
So it didn't matter if they sucked.
Yeah, they're sending letters to your wife saying your husband's cheating on you. They're sending letters to the Crips and the Bloods and the Young Lords, gangs in LA, and saying oh, this person said something about you, in order to cause, chaos and distrust.
Yeah. But was that, what is our sense of that was a sort of byproduct of the other attempts to do something? Or was that really we understand that these bonds are important to a movement and we're going to try and break them and weaken them?
Absolutely. Trying to sow
Discord.
discord, paranoia. There's a whole COINTELPRO collection of these documents edited by Ward Churchill. That's, not only do they have the crazy bizarro land letters that they write trying to represent themselves as cool Black Panthers, but the memos about what they're trying to do. And it's all just within the CIA, with the CIA kind of trying to sabotage these Central American elections. It's an attempt to pick a side, right, on things that had really not necessarily anything to do with security. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine that a state would not take on an entity that had arrayed itself against the state, like the Black Panthers, right? But there was no, let's say there was no accountability and discipline, right? Mm-hmm. So you had kind of bad people drunk on their own power, destroying lives, innocent lives in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
Can we also talk about how this tactic backfires when it comes to the Klan and white supremacist groups? Because when they infiltrate those groups as well, then white supremacist groups, white nationalists who were hardcore patriotic, all of a sudden have now a huge distrust of the federal government, which I think we see remnants of this totally playing out today, in which these white, radicalized groups don't believe the government, don't think that, the government is telling us the truth. And a lot of that comes from this moment as well.
This notion that the trust that people have that, the federal government was the representation of the sovereign will of the people is on our side, right? Yeah. Is something that's squandered by the forces of the state.
Right.
So in this church committee moment then, as these things come out and there are hearings that say, hey, we've been infiltrating the Black Power movement, the American Indian movement, Puerto Ricans, the New Left, the KKK. We've been spying on Ali and Davis and Jane Fonda and MLK and John Lennon, yada, yada, yada. We've been funding an extreme right-wing group in San Diego. Does that come out and the American people say, gee, thanks for letting us know. Good of you to let us know. I love, my government is so forthright that they're opening the books. Or does it just make everyone freak out and get paranoid?
They get a little paranoid, but it's not necessarily about these groups who many Americans see as outliers and groups that should be infiltrated. There aren't a lot of white Americans who are sympathetic, say, to the Black Panthers. But you also get the news, Jody, that the government is wiretapping phones and reading mail. And I think it's those more oh, this could have actually targeted us, the ordinary Americans, the ones who don't deserve to be surveilled, that I think starts to get people a little freaked out. The idea that these intelligence communities that were never empowered to spy on Americans are spying on Americans. I think, Rick, maybe you have more of a sense of this, but...
Yeah, I feel like it was the sense that you really see manifested in popular culture, right? A movie like 5 Days of the Condor, which actually, came out, was filmed before any of this stuff was known, and then was kind of superseded by events in which, like in the movie, the CIA is involved in a secret plot to take over the Arab oil fields or something, or like the Parallax View, in which, kind of the same people who were involved in covering up the Kennedy assassination were, involved in some similarly nefarious scheme. And what the popular culture is manifesting is a sense. There's even an episode of Good Times.
Wow.
You guys must know Jesse Walker's wonderful site on Reason Magazine. But if you look that up, you can find an episode of Good Times where one of the characters finds out they're being spied on by the I think the NSA or something like that.
Wow.
But it's like very different from the 1950s, in which when the dad on My Three Sons was kind of revealed to kind of be some sort of government spy, and it was just this noble kind of thing, protecting us from the bad guys. But the idea that nothing can be trusted, right? Which obviously is a material foundation for, a lot of the problems society is facing now. And that's when you begin to see, the elites kind of scratching their heads and saying, wow, what have we begun? And there's a really, really kind of strong reaction to that. That's really kind of one of the most disturbing things of all, because what it amounts to is kind of a culture of elite non-accountability. So one of the things that was fascinating was the Pulitzer Board recommended Seymour Hersh for a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting that revealed, the CIA spying in the first place. And the trustees of Columbia, which kind of do the final sign-off, denied him the Pulitzer Prize. Right. And one of the voices all along talking about this is, something that was, denuding our capacity to, defend liberty here and abroad was Ronald Reagan, who was on the Rockefeller Commission. And when he was, doing his radio addresses and, as his kind of day job in 1975, after his gubernatorial term before he ran for president, it was all about how this is making us less safe. And that idea really kind of found its way into the mainstream when Senator William Fulbright, who was really the first guy to really confront the Johnson administration for lying about Vietnam, he wrote an article in Columbia Journalism Review, and I'll just quote from it because it's quite stunning. I have come to feel of late that these are not the kind of truths we most need right now. These truths which must injure, if not kill, a nation. And that what was needed was, quote, restored stability and confidence, and that the press required voluntary restraint to reaffirm the social contract. And William Greeter, who was this amazing investigative journalist for the Washington Post, who died a couple of years ago, did an amazing book about the Federal Reserve, wrote an article about it in Esquire about how the Washington Post, which of course had played such a role in bringing down a president, was now kind of coming around to the idea that basically like enough is enough, right? Like we did this and now we're going to move on. This is Greeter. There's a strong wish all over town, meaning Washington, a palpable feeling that it would be nice if somehow this genie could be put back in the bottle. A nostalgic longing for the easy consensual atmosphere which once existed among the contending elements in Washington. And he said the press essentially tugs back and forth at itself, alternately pushing the adrenal instincts unleashed by Watergate, the rapid distrust bred by a decade of out-front official lies, and then abruptly playing the cozy lapdog. And there are all kinds of examples of this where basically there was kind of voluntary restraints. I found that in my research in which some of the most amazing things that would appear in the hearings would not get covered. Right. Wow. I mean, they just wouldn't show up. So the NSA deputy director was a guy named Benson Buffum, and he was interrogated in a public hearing by Senator Walter Mondale. Mondale, we are concerned about its legality. This is the episode where they collected all the telegrams every night. Buffum says legality, whether it was legal. In what sense? Whether what would have been legal? Whether that would have been a legal thing to do? Yes. Then the NSA guy says that particular aspect didn't enter into the discussion.
Wow.
Right. And now we have ProQuest, right? And we have newspapers.com. I could not find a single reference
That's amazing.
to that. I mean, people had kind of just had enough.
Right.
And to me,
Yeah.
that is a big part of the road that leads to Reagan. This basically, we can't handle the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is that phrase that these are not the truths we need right now? I mean, that's
These are not the truths we need right now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
I think
I
the
think-
truth we need is that America is a light unto the nations, and we're a city on a hill.
I think a lot of that, I can't remember, this was maybe a couple years ago, but when there was like a revival of talking about MLK and, his affairs or the things that he did that were, would not be looked upon favorably today. And people were just not here for it. And I think that's because also like there is a desire to maintain a certain memory about people that we think were, leaders or progressive or admirable. And we don't want those totems or those statues to be torn down. And a lot of that is also reminiscent of the fact that we don't want to necessarily hear about, the affairs, the relationships, the real nitty-gritty personal scandals that feel like you are,
Human?
yeah, for the most part human. But I don't think there's that much of a taste, depending upon the leader, I should say. There's not that much of an appetite for it.
All right. So as we wrap up, one thing that we've touched on a couple times and we've hinted at a little bit here, but it's just worth saying, it is this interesting thing where do you have an FBI file on you and how long is it? Becomes a sort of badge of honor among the counterculture to some extent. And I mean, is it actually around this time with the church committee stuff that the people get access to their files? But there's this whole sort of generation that then gets access to their files, FOIAs it, and then just is like, oh my gosh, as you were describing, Rick, like they knew everywhere I lived, and it is this interesting badge of honor.
Well, the Freedom of Information Act passes in 1966, and it's expanded over time. So Lyndon Johnson signs it on July 4th, 1966. This idea, transparency is the American way, right? And so there definitely are, getting your FBI files a thing. A friend of mine who was a radical publisher got his FBI file, and they were very concerned about the fact that when he was in college, he would have big amounts of money passing through his bank account, and they presumed he was helping launder money for the Communist Party. And it turned out his dad was laundering money from the IRS through his bank account.
Well, what's interesting, you mentioned that FOIA was passed, and it was, but it was then strengthened in the Privacy Act of 74 and the Government and Sunshine Act. So there is this
that was a post-Watergate thing.
This move after Watergate and during this church committee era to really give people the tools that they need to get more transparency in government.
Yeah. All right, we're going to leave our episode on meddling at home there. Our next episode is going to be what we're calling Meddling in Your Mind, and that is about MK Ultra and all of these things. And we actually already did an episode about MK Ultra, so we're just going to rerun that. But Rick, you were not part of that episode, so you got 30 seconds or a minute you want to give us on MK Ultra?
Well, I mean, my favorite thing about MK Ultra is that a lot of the voluntary LSD subjects ended up being the people who turned LSD into a recreational drug. Yeah. So, I mean, I think we talk about the incompetence of the security state, the fact that it actually ended up into the amounting to the exact opposite of its intention of, creating a generation of people who were perfectly willing to, plunge into an anti-authoritarian attitude because the mind's being expanded by this drug that was supplied to them by the U.S. government.
Totally. So there's a ton of fascinating stuff there, and a lot of that was revealed during the church committee hearing. So the housekeeping here is next episode, we're going to rerun that. People can listen to that, and then we will be back for one final episode. Rick will be back for one final episode where we will look at going after the press and then kind of legacy, bigger thoughts, and so forth. Okay. But that is the end of this episode. Nicole Hemmer, Kelly Carter-Jackson, Rick Perlstein, thanks to you, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Jody.
Cheers.
My pleasure.
In the area of women's liberation, report after report about meetings of women who got together to talk about their problems. So we have informants running all over the country, checking up about what housewives are talking about in their efforts to decide whether women should have a different role in the society. Nothing to do with violence, nothing to do with these labels of subversion and extremism. And what's the conclusion on the document? Quotes, "We'll continue to follow and report the activities of the women's liberation movement."
Radiotopia.